This podcast begins the first of two sessions with a focus on language in the classroom. Part of this exploration, an important part, focuses on English as an additional language. And within this, we'll give you some input on strategies and processes you might explore in orienting your practice around EAL. I have, however, resisted the impulse to jump straight in with this, in favour of a more considered approach. To properly understand EAL, we need to focus not just on possible practices, but on all of the theoretical and ethical decisions which must be made in relation to it. And these decisions are caught up in a much broader debate centred more generally on the role of language in learning, and the appropriate response to linguistic diversity in the classroom. It is then with these dilemmas that we begin our exploration, and this podcast intends to give you an anchoring to some of the debates which surround them. On one level, there's a surface importance to language. Ultimately, it's the medium through which all of the processes of education occur. When we teach directly in a didactic or teacher-led style, we deliver packages of knowledge and understanding through speech or writing. Even where learning is more student-centred or discovery-based, the way children access it is linguistically mediated. In, for instance, the way in which they access instructions surrounding activities or in interactions with peers. At the other end of the learning process, we often ask children to prove their learning through verbal or written language, and thus both formative and summative assessment tends to be linguistically mediated. Framing all of this, though, is a more subtle importance of language. We regulate the expectations, rules and regimes of our classrooms through verbal instruction, and a child's ability to interface with these bits of communication can have other profound effects. In this respect, it's interesting how often naughty behaviour can be connected to "I don't understand what I'm doing." There is then a surface importance to language, an importance which we should consider carefully. Beyond this, however, is a potentially deeper significance, one which sees language not just as a technical tool, but as a facet of identity and of cultural capital, and perhaps even as the matter out of which thought is formed. The latter of these arguments has spawned a theory called linguistic determinism. Advocates of this perspective would maintain that we think using words, and therefore that the sophistication and accuracy of our language use underpins our capacity to think. This position has caused significant controversy, and as a result, different extremes of its arguments have evolved. At one end is a kind of hard determinism, which maintains that language is the building blocks of thought, and therefore, if I have a more sophisticated grammar and a more expansive vocabulary, I'm more likely to be able to think in more impressive ways. It means that the categories available to define experience are more subtle, and the understandings of them are more nuanced. Or that I can arrange these concepts in relation to other concepts in a more acrobatic way. Hard linguistic determinism therefore suggests that we can't think outside of the language which is available to us. At the other extreme, soft linguistic determinism offers a more tempered take. Here is a position which argues that thought is possible outside of language, but that thought only becomes useful in that we can communicate it to others. Thus, our capacity to use language determines our ability to make our thinking known to others, and thus to make it useful. There is then a body of debate around the importance of language to thought, and thus directly to learning. There are also significances, though, which are broader than this, and which connect directly to other facets of this unit. Language is a part of children's cultural capital, part of that body of experience and understanding which they bring with them to the classroom. It is also intimately tied to identity and senses of self. On one level, this is a sophisticated process. We reinscribe our identity by telling stories about who we are, both to ourselves and to others. Beyond this, though, we start to define ourselves according to the languages that we engage with. We are attached, for instance, to accent and dialect. This is evident in the fascination we find in those first weeks of university in the ways we say things differently. Similarly, social groups hang together on the basis of shared vocabulary, on slang for instance, which signals not just shared meaning, but the significance of sharing that meaning. Framed in this way, language develops a new importance in relation to schooling, and new ethical challenges are raised. We must be careful in denying those languages that children bring to the classroom with them that we do not also deny aspects of their identity. More practically though, we must be careful that over-reliance on a preferred form of language does not de-skill children who are less familiar with that form by removing their ability to use those linguistic tools that they do have. Lurking in the background here is a separate debate, which centres on whether one particular form of language is better than any other. A further treatment of this debate is given in the theory briefing sheet which accompanies this podcast. For now, it serves to set out some key parameters in the discussion. At one end are a group of theorists who would suggest that Standard English is inherently superior, that it's dominant because it's the most correct, most expressive, and most easily understood way of using the language. At the other is a perspective which suggests that the dominance of Standard English is an accident of history, tied to the popularisation of the printing press in the southeast of England. They argue that its dominance is tied to power, that it remains dominant because it's the language of the white and the middle class, rather than because it is an inherently better form. These theorists have produced evidence which demonstrates that non-Standard English users can produce expressive and articulate thinking when allowed to do so in the language with which they are most comfortable. Between these two perspectives lies a third, which acknowledges the value of vernacular, but which recognises that while Standard English may not be inherently better, it is the standard. Education and society at large is conducted through its medium, and we therefore have a duty to ensure that children can use it, even if this isn't at the expense of other forms of linguistic variation. For this perspective, the imperative is that we enable learners to code switch, to recognise genres in language, and that different forms are appropriate in different contexts. It's these dilemmas, amongst others, with which I'd like you to grapple in this next session. I'd like you to consider the origins of linguistic diversity, in relation to the underlying unit precept that it stems from diverse origins, which include not just EAL, but also regional accents and dialects, slang and so on. I'd like you to think about the impacts of language in the classroom, and also the way in which our practice around language impacts on learners. Finally, I'd like you to explore some of the tensions and dilemmas which surround our attitudes towards Standard English, and to notice the problems which arise from our particular perspective on it.